So this next guest, she was here before last month along with her mom. You may remember them as the mother-daughter duo that both captured the Miss St. Kitts and Nevis crown. This time, the daughter, Genelle Lake, is back with us to discuss more about something serious. Genelle is a certified information system security professional. Today, she's here with us to share so that we can prioritize cybersecurity as we lead a more digital life. Hi, Genelle, how are you?
Hi, I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm great. It's great to see you. So can you tell us exactly what is cybersecurity?
So, of course, happily. They have a lot of really intense academic definitions of what cybersecurity is, and I'm always afraid to use them because they tend to scare people off.
Yes.
And they give the impression, yes, and they give the impression that cybersecurity is really only for technical professionals or for the experts, when that really isn't the case. Or even it makes people believe that it only exists at an enterprise level, which also is not the case. But essentially, cybersecurity is the process of reducing the risk of cyber attacks. So it's all about making sure that the technologies and the practices that we engage in help to keep us and our devices and our electronic data safe. That's essentially it in a nutshell.
In speaking to those cyber attacks or the threats, I was asking, what are some of the common threats that people face online?
Yes. The common ones, well, we expose ourselves to a great deal of threats by just browsing carelessly online, I would say. So we go to social media and some nice attractive headline catches us, and without really doing our due diligence and checking to see if the site that we're browsing to is legitimate and generally, on the up and up, we just click, without thinking about it. We just click and we get directed to God knows what. Sometimes it's safe, sometimes it turns out not to be safe. We also are not very careful about how we treat with email messages. And actually, let me not say email messages because it expands beyond email messages, the dangers in this regard, because I'm certain you've gotten messages from Samsung claiming that you've won some prize. And I'm sure you can't recall entering into any sweepstakes. So, and I think we just go about our daily lives, clicking on things, responding to things without giving it adequate thought. It is akin to someone knocking on your door and you answering without really vetting and verifying that the person on the other side is not there to harm you. And so we would do well to avoid these sorts of practices to make sure that we secure ourselves as we exist in this online reality.
Yes. So what are some of the things that businesses and persons could do to protect themselves?
So we engage in some really, really harmful practices. And I'm referring to practices like sharing user accounts. This is something that I see done routinely where Netflix accounts are concerned, and sharing your user credentials, your passwords to your accounts is akin to giving random people the keys to your home. And we avoid this. Really, when we have passwords, we should keep them to ourselves. Our passwords are unique to us and to us only. They should not be shared with anyone else, especially as we also engage in the bad habit of reusing passwords everywhere. So essentially, if I know I use a password everywhere, I certainly don't want to be giving it to anyone to use, and then they would have access to all of my online platforms because I have this habit of reusing passwords. We also have a habit of making passwords less than secure. And by that I mean our passwords, when we set them, they tend to be generally weak, so they don't have the requisite complexity. They tend to be simple one-word passwords that people who know us might be able to guess because they might be based on some meaningful information to us: our date of birth, our wedding anniversary, our first address, our significant other's name, that sort of thing. And we really want to avoid doing this. We want to make sure we make our passwords as complex as possible because then that would give us a fighting chance, Another thing we do, we rely only on passwords. And you might be wondering, what is she talking about? You're supposed to be relying on your passwords. No, not really. You don't want to put all of your trust in your passwords. That is, I like going back to the example of a house and the security that you put in place for where you live and where your family resides. You relying on a password for security only is akin to on the lock for your doorknob. as opposed to also engaging the protections offered by a deadbolt or by a tower bolt. And so we really want to make sure in that regard, from a cybersecurity standpoint, what you want to make sure you do is that you enable multi-factor authentication for all of your online platforms. And so what this means is that in order to gain access to your account, you would need to successfully present a username, a password, which is something you know, and a third factor or a second factor, which is something you either have or something that you are. It could be a fingerprint as something that you are, a retina scan, that's another thing that you are, or you could make use of token codes, and they have physical token codes that you could walk around with. I'm sure we're all familiar with them from a banking standpoint. Banks would have issued some of these to help us to protect our online bank accounts. They also have the soft kind that you walk around with on your phone. And so what this does, this would help you to add an extra layer of security to your account so that if your password does become compromised, you don't immediately lose access to your online account. Your full account itself is not compromised, because then there's this additional factor that has to be presented in order for full access to be granted to your account. And so you really want to make sure these are at the very basic level of things that we should all hope to implement to secure ourselves in this new online world that we exist in.
In the event of a cybersecurity compromise, what steps should be taken to recover, say, any data that is lost, or to stop or mitigate the effects of that breach?
So to begin with, I'm going to hope that prior to becoming compromised, there are some very robust backups that one could revert to, so that in the event that there's any sort of break in operations or any loss of data, you could always go back to a very recently taken backup to as a recovery point, as a very safe recovery point. If you don't have the resources in-house to help you to do this sort of analysis, to help you to determine, how bad the compromise is, exactly how you were breached, how to correct the situation, and how to move on. And I like to think that most of our modern day technology professionals have this expertise to be able to do this sort of investigation and provide the necessary informed feedback to guide going forward. There are services available, there are service providers available that you might have to reach out to help you to get this level of information. But definitely you want to start off with making sure that you have a very robust backup plan in place, because life happens. And it's not just compromise as a result of a cybersecurity attack, but of a cyber attack, that is. But we do lose access to our operations. We do become non-operational for a number of reasons. And it's always a good practice to have a good, recently taken, known good backup point to restore from. So I would definitely recommend that.
All right, in terms of a cybersecurity checklist, what are some of the things that we can do to ensure that businesses in general, and even individuals, that we are doing what we need to do to make sure that we are secure digitally? I think a first one that I would mention is perhaps identifying a trustworthy IT vendor.
Right, we definitely want to make sure we identify trustworthy IT vendors. And this applies, the trustworthiness applies even beyond the vendors when we make use of online facilities and cloud-based tools. We want to make sure that these tools, these platforms, these vendors are in fact trustworthy. But before we even go there, I think one of the first things that needs to be done is we need to always make sure we're wearing our cyber hats and our risk hats, because you want to make sure that it doesn't make sense that you go with a best of breed security IT platform or a best of breed IT vendor if our own in-house security practices are not in order. So you want to make sure that from a cybersecurity awareness standpoint, yourself and your users and anyone who will be interacting with the platforms, with the tools that you make use of, always make the best decisions with regard the use of these tools. And I spoke to some of them in terms of making sure you avoid malicious email messages, other types of messages that might be malicious, SMS, for instance. I touched on that. You also want to make sure that you observe good cyber hygiene with the use of your passwords and how you secure your online accounts. So these are some of the things you want to make sure you have in place. But from a vendor standpoint and from a tool standpoint, you want to make sure that they are in alignment with some of the industry standards in terms of cybersecurity and information security as a base level, because that would help to give you some assurance that they have cybersecurity best practices in mind in all that they do. So definitely you'd want to make sure that, of course, we can't go into everything that you should look for, but it's always a good item to check off on the list to make sure that whoever you are engaging with, whoever you're doing business with, is in alignment with international best practices where cybersecurity is concerned.
So is it a case where potentially if they have a website, for instance, as businesses, that we'd be able to look at their information policy?
Sorry, could you repeat that question for me?
Certainly, I will repeat that. I was saying, in terms of learning what standards these businesses hold themselves to, I've been to websites and I've seen certain times that they tell you what their privacy policies, they tell you who, what standards they hold. So is that something that if we're interacting with businesses, we can expect to retrieve from their site, for instance? Or do we just have conversations with these vendors about that?
You definitely want to have the conversation, and you're right, you should really do your own investigations in that regard. So you want to interrogate these businesses and their online presences to make sure that because if I am in alignment with some international standard and I've gone through the process of becoming aligned or certified, and those things are not easy, I would want to advertise these things. So the businesses that have gone through that process, they really make it a point to make this certification known to the general public. And so they make this information publicly available on their websites. And so as a first step, you'd really want to do your own research and your own due diligence, as I mentioned earlier. You'd want to make sure you go to the businesses' web presences, their websites, you interrogate the websites, see what they present, see what they align with or not, as the case may be. And still follow up with a conversation with the vendor. Ask them to submit evidence of certification or alignment with these cybersecurity industry standards. And this is what you would use in your decision making. Do I want to engage with this vendor? Do I want to trust this person with my sensitive data, whether personal or professional? So these are definitely some places you want to look at, some things you want to look at before you decide who you're going into business with and who you're engaging.
Well, thank you very much, Genelle, for taking the time to shed some light on cybersecurity for me personally and for our viewers as well. Always a pleasure to see you. I'm certain it won't be the last time. Looking forward to our next conversation. Who knows what we'll discuss? So thank you again for taking the time.
Thank you. Take care.